Look, I want to talk about something we all do without really thinking about it. We ignore things, small things, a weird noise, a feeling that something's off. We tell ourselves it's nothing because admitting it might be something, that's uncomfortable. I've done it, you've probably done it, and the three people whose stories I'm about to share with you, they did it too, until they couldn't anymore. These aren't ghost stories. These are real experiences from real people who learned the hard way that sometimes that feeling you're ignoring, it's trying to save you. I went camping alone last winter with my dog Roscoe, and I'll never do it again. I had some time off work and honestly just wanted to get away from people for a bit. So I loaded up my truck with my gear and drove up this narrow trail that cuts deep into a state forest. The road was barely maintained, covered in packed snow and ice, and I didn't see another car the entire way up. After about an hour of driving, I parked at this small pull-off that looked like no one had used it in months. From there, I hiked another 20 minutes with my pack and Roscoe until I found a clearing surrounded by thick trees. The snow was deep and completely untouched. No footprints, no signs of anyone else. That's exactly what I wanted. I set my pack down, cleared a spot for the tent, and let Roscoe wander around while I worked. He stayed close, sniffing the snow and the trees, just being a dog. I pitched the tent, staked it down hard because the ground was frozen solid, and laid out my sleeping pad and winter-rated sleeping bag inside. It was going to be a cold night, well below freezing, so I layered up properly. Thermal base layers, thick socks, fleece, heavy jacket. I kept most of it on even after the tent was set up. Once everything was ready, I gathered some dead wood and built a small fire. I cooked dinner over it, nothing fancy, and just sat there on a log eating while Roscoe lay near the flames. The woods were quiet in that deep winter way where sound feels almost non-existent. My dad taught me years ago that snow actually absorbs sound, and out there you could really feel it. After I finished eating, Roscoe suddenly stood up and started barking toward the trees. It didn't concern me at first. There were deer everywhere out there, and he'd barked at them plenty of times before. I told him to relax, and after a minute, he sat back down. I checked the time and figured I'd stay up a little longer by the fire before turning in. I always carry a handgun when I'm camping in remote places, and it was holstered at my side like always. At that point, I felt fine. About 20 minutes later, Roscoe started barking again, louder this time, and then I heard it too, footsteps moving through the snow somewhere out in the woods. I stood up and listened. The steps stopped. Then they started again. Roscoe went from barking to growling, and then suddenly he went completely silent. He just stood there, staring straight ahead toward the trees. That's when I started feeling uneasy. I followed his gaze and saw a shape at the edge of the tree line. Someone was standing there, half hidden in the darkness, just barely lit by the firelight. I called out, told him he scared me, tried to sound casual. The figure didn't move at first. Then he stepped forward slightly, just enough for me to see it was a man. He asked what I was doing out there that deep in the woods. His tone wasn't friendly. I told him I was just getting out into nature with my dog. He didn't respond right away. He just stood there, watching me. I could feel the situation turning wrong. So I told him, calmly, that I was armed. The man sort of laughed. He said something about me threatening him instead of inviting him to join me, asked where my hospitality was. Then he turned and walked back into the darkness. His footsteps faded into the woods. I stood there for a long time after that, just staring at the trees. Roscoe stayed close to me. I didn't like any of it, but eventually I told myself he was gone. I put out the fire carefully, throwing snow on it and stirring the ashes until there was nothing left that could glow. I didn't want light drawing attention. I crawled into my tent and sealed it up. Inside, I did everything I could to stay warm, kept my sleeping pad down to insulate from the cold ground, stayed fully dressed, pulled on a knit hat, cinched my sleeping bag tight. I kept hand warmers near my core and feet. Roscoe curled up next to me, and his body heat helped more than anything. I lay there listening to the woods, or really, listening to the silence. After a while, Roscoe started growling again. Then I heard what he was growling at: footsteps in the snow. They stopped. Roscoe quieted down, but his ears were still perked up. Then the footsteps started again, closer this time, and slower. They came right up to the tent, and stopped. Roscoe started howling loudly. I whispered for him to stop, terrified of making more noise. When he did stop, he went back to growling. Whoever it was just stood outside the tent. I could hear subtle movement, like the shift of weight in the snow. I had my gun in my hand now, but I didn't want to make threats. I didn't want to be forced to follow through. I've never actually shot anyone, and honestly, I don't think I have it in me to kill someone, even in self-defense. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I cocked the gun and said clearly that I had a weapon, and whoever was there needed to leave, now. Realistically, who else could it have been besides that guy earlier? There was silence for a few seconds. Then I heard footsteps again, moving away from the tent, slowly at first, then faster, before disappearing into the woods. I didn't zip the tent to look out. I stayed frozen for hours. Roscoe stayed alert the entire time, which was the only reason I felt remotely comfortable eventually nodding off. I definitely wouldn't have if I were alone. I barely slept, only drifting off in short bursts. When the sky finally started to lighten, I packed up as fast as I could at the crack of dawn. We hiked back to my truck and drove away. I never went back to that part of the woods again, and I never will. This happened July 4th weekend, 2025. I drove from Melbourne, Florida to Charleston, South Carolina to visit a good friend of mine named Mark. I hadn't seen him in years. He was there on an internship for his law program, staying in a house in the city. I was visiting for the weekend and spending the night downstairs on a couch near some windows that faced another apartment building and a small maze of alleyways, with an abandoned house across the street. After a smooth drive, I got to Charleston and we played some pickleball before it got dark. Pretty normal day. The next morning, after playing more pickleball and just hanging out, we went to the main Charleston market. We walked through it and eventually came out near the docks by the water. That's when we saw him. A man in a wedding suit, shambling down the road near the water. He wore a crisp bow tie, clean dress shoes, and his suit looked freshly pressed. He had long black curly hair and a tan complexion. The market behind us was loud and busy, but this man moved alone across the street with this slow, detached movement. He didn't notice us. He seemed to be in his own world. If we'd crossed the street right then, we would have walked straight into him. Instinctively, I didn't want to go near him. I grabbed Mark by the arm and told him we weren't crossing. We walked to the right instead, deeper into the city, and picked up our pace. He was moving so slowly that we created distance easily. I told Mark it was strange. The guy didn't look homeless. His clothes were too clean, too crisp. Something about him just felt wrong. Mark agreed. We kept walking. A few streets later, on another busy stretch of Charleston, we looked toward a shop and saw him again. That same man, with the same shambling movement. He was far down the street, diagonal to us, moving at the same slow pace. Somehow he'd caught up to us, even though there was no clear way he could have reached that spot without us seeing him. I pointed him out to Mark, and we both just stared. It made no sense. He was in a completely different part of the city, but moving exactly the same way. We pushed it aside and kept exploring. The next day was July 4th, and that night we watched fireworks on an island about 20 minutes from the city. By then, we'd mostly forgotten about the man in the suit. We assumed he was just some strange person wandering around. But something about him had set off bell alarms. It felt out of place. Wrong. That night, we went on a ghost tour, which we'd already planned before the trip. It was my last night in Charleston, July 5th, and the city was packed. It was a busy Saturday night, with crowds everywhere, lights pouring from restaurants, and that historical atmosphere Charleston has after sunset. We finished the ghost tour and walked through the main area filled with restaurants and nightlife. The street was crowded, and this particular wave of people was moving toward us pretty fast. As the group approached, both Mark and I noticed something at the exact same moment. It was him, the same man in the same wedding suit with the same bow tie and the same black curly hair, shambling in the middle of the crowd as if he'd been placed there. He stood out instantly. His movement was completely different from everyone else. He didn't blend in. But no one around him seemed to notice him. Two people were walking right beside him, and he brushed between them without either of them reacting. He kept the same slow, unsettling pace while the entire crowd moved normally around him. He glanced at us for a brief second, then continued forward. It was like he was tied to the movement of the crowd without truly being part of it. Mark and I looked at each other in shock. It made no sense. He didn't belong there, and something in both of us recognized that immediately. We watched him move down the street until the crowd thinned out. When it did, we saw him clearly, still shambling, still moving at that same unnatural pace, disappearing into a darker side street until he turned a corner. We were quiet, not panicking, but deeply unsettled. The same man, in the same suit, appearing multiple times in different parts of the city. Always shambling, always out of place. Both of us knew something was wrong. Later that night, we went back to the house. Mark went upstairs to his room, and I went downstairs to sleep. I shut the blinds and tried to settle in. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up to a tap on the window. I froze. After a few moments, I forced myself to look. I lifted the blinds slightly and looked down the alley. At the far end, I saw the back of a man turning the corner. It was him. He moved out of sight, but right before he disappeared, he looked back toward the window. I told Mark the next morning. I explained what I saw, and even he admitted the entire experience was disturbing. He doesn't believe in anything paranormal. He's extremely logical and grounded, but even he was shaken. As for me, I'm more spiritually sensitive, and this experience has stayed with me. I know it stayed with Mark too, months later. We'll never forget that weekend. The man in the suit felt real and irreal at the same time. Something about it was just off. I drove home to Florida on July 6th, and the image of him turning that corner has stayed with me ever since.
I never thought I'd be the kind of person who double-checks door locks or memorizes the sounds of my own floorboards. But that changed after 1 week last winter. I live alone in a small house I bought a few years ago. My routine has been pretty boring and predictable. I work from home, order groceries, go to the gym late at night, and I don't talk to my neighbors much. That routine is probably why it took me longer than it should have to realize something was wrong. It started with a noise I heard around 2:30 in the morning on a Tuesday. I was half asleep on the couch with the TV still on low when I heard what sounded like a soft thump near the back of the house. It wasn't loud enough to scare me. My first thought was that something had fallen in the kitchen, or maybe the house had shifted. We all hear sounds like that once in a while, right? I muted the TV to listen. Nothing else happened. I checked the back door, made sure it was locked, and went to bed. The next morning, I noticed the back door felt different when I opened it. The deadbolt still worked, but the handle felt loose, like it had been twisted too hard. I made a mental note to fix it later. That night, I went to the gym around 11 p.m. like I usually do. Side note, I like an empty gym.
I got back around midnight to 12:30. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed my porch light was off, but I always leave it on. I sat there in my car for a few seconds, trying to remember if I'd turned it off earlier. Then I convinced myself I probably did. Inside, everything looked normal. I walked through every room just doing a quick check before bed, something I'd never done before. Thursday morning, I woke up to my alarm and noticed my phone was at 12% battery. I always charge it overnight, and I clearly remembered plugging it in. The cable was still connected to my phone, but the charger was no longer connected to the outlet. Weird. I told myself I must have knocked it loose in my sleep, but that explanation didn't really make sense because my phone was still on the nightstand, not in bed with me. My only explanation was that I'd picked up my phone in the middle of the night, accidentally yanked it off the outlet without realizing, and set it back down. I started paying closer attention after that. That night, I stayed up later than usual, sitting in the dark with the TV off, just listening. Around 3 a.m, I heard slow thumps coming from the back of the house. Footsteps? I asked myself. Nah, it can't be. I held my breath. The thumps stopped. After a while, I convinced myself they came from outside. I'm in the suburbs. There are other people around even at night. The next day, I found muddy shoe prints on the floor near the back door. The thing is, the footprints weren't clear. I couldn't distinctly make out patterns from the bottoms of the shoes, which made it look like someone had tried to wipe them off before walking around. My stomach literally dropped. I stood there staring at them, trying to understand how they got there. I hadn't had anyone over. I hadn't gone outside in muddy shoes. I checked the back door again, and this time I noticed faint scratch marks around the lock, like someone had used something thin to pry at it. I called the locksmith and told him I thought my lock was failing. I didn't say anything about the footprints. He replaced the lock that afternoon and told me everything should be fine. That night, I pushed a chair under the back door handle and slept with my bedroom door locked, something I'd never done before. I woke up just before 4 a.m. to the sound of something tapping lightly on my bedroom door. It wasn't a knock. It sounded like someone testing the door with their fingertips. I stayed completely still, staring at the door. My eyes were burning because I refused to blink. The tapping stopped after a minute, and then I heard soft footsteps moving away. I didn't sleep after that. In the morning, the chair was still under the back door, but the back door itself was unlocked. The new lock wasn't damaged, it had just been turned. That's when reality truly set in. Someone had been inside my house while I was asleep, and they knew how to unlock the door from the inside. I called the police and tried to explain without sounding insane. They checked the house, looked around the yard, and told me there was no sign of forced entry, which, was kind of obvious since I'd changed the lock. They suggested I might have unlocked the door myself without remembering. I knew that wasn't true, but there was nothing they could do. That night, I stayed awake with all the lights on and a kitchen knife on the table in front of me. Around 2 a.m, I heard something from down in the basement. The basement door, which was just outside the kitchen, was cracked open. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. I stared down the hallway at that cracked open door. I walked over to it and peeked down through the crack, and I swear it wasn't my imagination. I saw the outline of someone standing there, either at the bottom of the stairs or maybe on one of the lowest steps. I don't know if they were looking up or not. When I realized what I was looking at, I slammed the door shut and sprinted out to my car. I sat in my car and called 911 again. After the police showed up a second time, they entered while I waited in one of their cars. They brought him out of the house in handcuffs a few minutes later. He was barefoot, wearing dark clothes that looked like they'd been slept in. He didn't look at me once. I don't think he even noticed me in the back of the car. They put him in the back of the other car and shut the door. I stayed outside while more officers went back in. I refused to look at the guy. I was shaking even as I talked to the officers. I was stuttering in shock. It took longer than I expected for them to finish searching. When one of the officers finally came out, he asked how long I'd lived there. I told him a few years. He nodded and wrote something down. Then he asked what time I usually went to the gym and which nights. I told him. He looked back at the house and told me they'd found food wrappers and bottled water behind the furnace in the basement, along with a phone charger plugged into an outlet down there. He said it looked like someone had been sleeping on the concrete, using old insulation as padding. The man hadn't spoken a word to the officers. They told me the likely charges he'd be facing, but that ultimately it would be up to the district attorney. Eventually, they told me I could go back inside. It was days later that I was scrolling through my camera roll to send something to a friend when I found a very, very disturbing picture. At first, I had to process how a picture like this could even be taken. It was a photo of me in my bed sleeping, taken at 3:11 a.m. It was the same night I'd woken up to my phone being unplugged from the outlet. The nightmare became real all over again. I contacted the unit listed on the incident report, and they asked me to come in to digitally transfer the photo for supplemental evidence. I was told with this photo he'd likely be facing additional charges, stalking, maybe even being registered as a sex offender for life. All good things to hear. But it doesn't save me from the trauma I'll forever have to live with. I'll never be able to go down into a basement alone at night again in my life.
3 stories. 3 people who ignored something small until it became something they couldn't ignore anymore. The camper who heard footsteps and convinced himself it was nothing. The visitor who saw the same man 3 times and told himself it was coincidence. The homeowner who heard noises and assumed the house was settling. They all learned the same lesson. Sometimes, that feeling you're ignoring isn't paranoia. It's your body trying to warn you. I'm not saying live in fear. I'm saying trust your instincts. Lock your doors. Pay attention when something feels wrong. Because the scariest thing about these stories isn't what happened. It's how normal everything seemed right before it wasn't.